Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So now that we went ahead and we talked about America before 1500, and we talked about Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, I want to go ahead and focus on what we're actually going to be talking about today, and what we're actually going to be looking at today. And what we're going to be talking about is the Americas before 1500. So that's the plan. That's what I want to look at today. So to start us off, we have to really kind of figure out excuse me, sorry guys. We have to kind of figure out, how did people get to the Americas in the first place? How did they get here? So there is a theory that of how people arrived in the Americas. I want to kind of emphasize that it is a theory. It doesn't mean that scientists or archaeologists know for a 100% irrefutable fact that this is exactly how it happened, and nobody can prove otherwise that this was how people arrived in the Americas. But it is the theory with the most evidence at this time. Some of you may have heard different stories, some of you may have learned differently, but at least in class this year, what we're going to look at in the theory we're going to look at is the Bering land bridge theory, which is at this current moment what archaeologists and scientists kind of accept as the method of how people arrived in the Americas. So that's why I want to take a look at it. That's why I'm going to reference it. It doesn't mean that it is irrefutable fact and stuff like that. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that before I continued on and I kept going. So in the first ice age, temperatures in all around the world dropped, and they dropped a lot, to the point where you started seeing glaciers forming in oceans all over the world. And because ice was forming, because glaciers were forming, that caused the ocean levels of the entire world to drop. And they dropped about 300 feet. Now, because this happened, it revealed a bridge, a thin strip of land between northeastern Russia, as you can see on the map right here, between northeastern Russia and Alaska, okay, and obviously northwestern North America. So, somewhere between 38,000 and 10,000 BC, scientists and archaeologists believe that a group known that they have kind of named as Paleo Indians traveled from traveled from northeastern Russia, northeastern Asia, and traveled across that land bridge, that strip of land, until they got to Alaska and North America. The reason they were doing it was because they were following their food. At this time, woolly mammoths were alive, so they were following those woolly mammoths and following their food and searching for other sources of food. So that's why they traveled from northeastern Russia to Alaska, and eventually why they made their way even farther south. Um, so, right around 8,000 BC, those ocean levels rose, which caused anyone that was still in North America, and anyone that still had, traveled further south or had migrated to other parts of the Americas, they were then stuck because those ocean levels had risen back up, which covered that land bridge in water, which is why we don't have a land bridge between northeastern Russia and Alaska today, because it's underwater. If ever there was a point where we had, where we had a global ice age, it might drop those water levels enough to reveal that land bridge again. But as of right now, that land bridge is buried underwater. So there is no land bridge that can connect northeastern Russia and Alaska at this point unless water levels drop. So I want to stop and take a second real quick, guys. I had mentioned to you that we would be able to answer question one of your notes that is due on Friday, that we would be able to answer question number one once we went over this and once we talked about this. So if we go ahead and we look at the question, how did prehistoric man get to the Americas? They crossed the Bering land bridge. That is the answer. That's how prehistoric man got to the Americas in the first place, according to this theory. So I wanted to take a minute. I wanted to stop. I wanted to make sure I clarified that so everybody was on the same page and everybody had that question answered. Just so you know, if you have questions 2 through 7 answered and you miss this and you don't take and fill that in, guys, for your homework, I'm not going to take off points if you only have one question missing. If you've got 2 or 3 missing, that's when I'm going to take off a couple more points, a couple of points for that assignment not being completed. But if this is the only question you don't have, don't freak out. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to take points off if you don't have that question answered, just so you know. So that is, there we go. That is how prehistoric man managed to get into the Americas in the first place. They crossed the Bering Land Bridge. So as time goes on, you have many different native tribes begin to grow and begin to kind of build their culture and stuff like that from this point when Paleo Indians crossed into the Americas. You started to see native tribes kind of create their own cultures and adapt and kind of adapt to the places they were living and stuff like that. 3 of those specific tribes are the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayas, and they were located in Central and South America. So from South America, we have the Incas. They lived in the Andes Mountains, and they were able to develop a strong central government and an extensive road system, considering that they lived in a mountain range that was very high up and very rugged to live in. So, excuse me, sorry guys. The Incas were one example of a native tribe from South America. The 2 from Central America are the Aztecs and the Maya. The Maya developed a sophisticated approach to math and astronomy and a more accurate calendar than Europe. The Aztecs were actually the ones that Europeans are going to meet and interact with. And we'll talk about the Aztecs a little more when we get to talking about Columbus and more specifically, or European explorers, I should say. We'll talk a little bit about Columbus. He didn't interact with the Aztecs, but a man by the name of Hernan Cortez did. And we'll talk about him and what he did to the Aztecs and all of that. We'll talk about that later in this unit. But the Aztecs actually founded a city known as Tenochtitlan. It's in the middle of a lake. It's a floating city in the middle of a lake, and they were able to build that in 1325. And it sits where modern day Mexico City does today. Okay? And it's in modern day Mexico. So those are the 3 tribes that were created in Central and South America. Excuse me. This is the Incas. They are the tribe that lived in the Andes. You can see kind of their form of farming where they have to create kind of terraced farming because they do live in mountains, so they can't take and farm on flat land, obviously. So this is the way they have to do it. They were also able to build an extensive road system and stuff like that. You have the Mayans who had used pyramids for religious purposes and religious ceremonies. And then you have the city of Tenochtitlan, which I said was built in the center of Lake Texcoco, and it is a floating city. Okay, so this is just some images of those 3 civilizations in Central and South America. Now, as we can see from this map, in North America, you have a lot of different tribes and a lot of different groups. And the way this map splits them up is into different culture areas. And that's how we're going to talk about them. That's how we're going to talk about those different groups. We might get a little bit specific on some of them, but I want to focus just on the different culture areas and talk about the different characteristics of each of those culture areas to give you an idea of how the people that lived in those culture areas, the natives that lived in those culture areas lived. Okay? So we're going to start off in the north and the northwest. The north is divided up into really 2 culture areas. It's divided up into the Arctic and the subarctic culture area. In the Arctic, you have tribes such as the Inuit and the Aleut. The Inuit lived in igloos, high tents, and huts, depending on the tribe and depending on what they were doing at that time. There were few plants, so groups relied mostly on hunting, which is why they had to kind of move with their food. So, depending on where they were, they either lived in igloos, hide tents, or huts. The Alouette lived in multifamily homes that were partially underground. Um, they shared many cultural features and shared many characteristics based on the fact that excuse me, they all kind of lived in an area with similar characteristics and stuff like that. Once you get to the subarctic area, you have such tribes as the Degrib or the Montagnais, and those areas followed the migrations of deer and lived in shelters made of animal skins or villages with homes made of log houses, depending on where their food was, where their game was that they were following. So many of the Arctic and subarctic tribes in the north were kind of hunter gatherers and they followed their food and they migrated with their food. In the northwest, you also had groups that survived by hunting and gathering, hunted animals, they fished, they foraged for wild plants, and they also carved totems, images of ancestor or animal spirits into wooden poles. These were very important to the tribes of the Northwest, and they held a lot of significance to them. And you most likely have seen images of totem poles before, but I don't unfortunately have one in this slideshow, but we will see one in the next lesson we do when we talk about Native American homes and stuff like that. So that was kind of the lives of tribes in the Northwest. When we move to the Western culture area or culture region, the Western culture region is also divided up into a couple different regions. You have the California region. Food was very plentiful in the California region. They were able to hunt, fish, they were able to gather plants. There wasn't a need to grow crops because they were able to find food so easily. Um, Most tribes in this region lived in groups of families from about 50 to 300. So you had, and most spoke over 100 languages. Many different groups. There were many different groups in this area that spoke over 100 languages. And most tribes in this region lived in groups of families from about 50 to 300. So I was kind of clustering my facts together, guys. I'm sorry about that. But you had many different groups that lived in the California region, and most tribes in this region lived in groups of families from about 50 to 300. So it could be a small group of families all the way to a very, very large group of families. Right? The other culture region that existed in the Western culture region was the Great Basin. In the Great Basin, many of the tribes there gathered seeds, they dug up roots, and trapped small animals. Most spoke the same language. This is an area that was part of the modern day states of Arizona and New Mexico, and a little bit of Utah and a little bit of Colorado. But it's a very dry area, so it's not a whole lot of, you don't have a whole lot of plants, you don't have a whole lot of ability to farm. So you have to gather seeds, dig up roots, and you have to trap small animals. So that is how tribes in the Great Basin area, excuse me, sorry guys, that's how tribes in the Great Basin area were able to get food and able to kind of feed themselves. In the Southwest region, you have a very famous tribe known as the Pueblo. They grew maize, squash, and beans. Their homes were built out of adobe or mud brick. Sometimes towns had more than 1,000 residents in them. Their religion focused on rain and maize. It was very important to them. They were focused on farming and growing crops. Also in the Southwest, you had the Apache and the Navajo. They were nomads and they moved from place to place and they hunted small animals and foraged for food. So that was how the Apache and the Navajo kind of fed themselves and how they took and were able to survive in the Southwest. Okay. So next up, we have the Great Plains. Most groups were nomadic hunters. They hunted buffalo, deer, elk, and other wild game. They used the buffalo skins for shields, clothing, and coverings for their teepees because there was not a whole lot of resources in the Great Plains other than what they got from the buffalo. The tribes in the Great Plains built teepees because they were able to not only there weren't a whole lot of materials, but also they were able to move from place to place and move their homes from place to place by using these teepees or cone-shaped tents, basically. So that's how they were able to live and survive. And using those resources for their homes helped them to follow those buffalo, deer, and elk herds that were their food and their resources. Some did grow crops that wasn't unheard of, but most groups were nomadic hunters. Some groups were also matrilineal. When it comes to matrilineal, that means that people trace their ancestry through their mothers. So, for example, if you are looking at European society and if you are looking at anyone that is of European descent, okay, for example, me, my last name is Carigliano. That is my father's last name. And if you are in a patrilineal society, that means that your last name follows your father's last name, not your mother's. However, if you are in a matrilineal society, you would have your mother's last name rather than your father's last name. Or for those of you that know your clan or what have you, that's why you have your mother's clan, not your father's clan, because it is a matrilineal society. That's why you might have your mother's clan rather than your father's, because it's a matrilineal society. So that is what matrilineal means. Some groups in the Great Plains are matrilineal. They trace their ancestry through their mothers. Okay? And last but not least, the Southeast and the Northeast. Most groups in the Southeast lived in farming villages. The Southeast and the Northeast had a lot of woods, had a lot of animals, had a lot of natural resources. So tribes in the Southeast could use the materials that they found, could use the materials that they had to build homes, to build tools, to grow crops, to hunt animals for food and stuff like that. So in the Southeast, you didn't have a whole lot of shortage of food and shortage of supplies to build villages, homes, and societies and tools and all of that. Northeast was the same way. Now, before I move on to the Northeast, one last thing about the Southeast. It was governed by village councils. Sorry, guys, excuse me. It was governed by village councils. Councils would kind of manage what was going on in the village and kind of make decisions for the village and whatnot. In the Northeast, you have some groups that are nomadic, but most are farmers. And a perfect example of a group that was that were considered kind of farmers. That doesn't mean, by the way, even though even though most groups are farmers, that doesn't mean that you don't take and go hunting and hunt for deer or hunt for any animal that you can use to feed yourself. Excuse me. But what it does mean is that you live in settled villages and you grow crops and stuff like that. And one of kind of the more famous groups in the Northeast is the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee were farmers, hunters, and traders. They settled in villages. They lived in longhouses, which were made from logs and bark that was home to many families, which could be as many as 20 or more, which were all related through the mother's side. Okay. The Haudenosaunee also created a confederation between 5 tribes, and it was created to keep peace and to protect their territory. Prior to this confederation, there was a lot of warfare and a lot of violence that occurred. However, once this confederation was created, it was created so that peace would exist and there would be a peace across the land that was the Haudenosaunee lived on. Okay, and they did it so that they could have peace and they could protect their territory. Um, they emphasized the equality of all people, and they made decisions through representatives and agreement. Now, we're going to take a look at the Haudenosaunee Confederation and take a look at we're going to take a look at that and how it works. Um, but many people take a look at that and make the argument that the U.S. Constitution and Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union were written and created based on the confederation that the Haudenosaunee created. So, just to show that the Haudenosaunee had that idea and were using that idea long before the United States came about and long before the United States was started. So, looking at all of these different culture regions and looking at all of these different culture areas, hopefully you guys have been able to kind of figure out and been able to kind of realize that what all of these Native American tribes and what all of these Native American groups that moved into North America and South America and Central America were able to do is they were able to take their surroundings and the areas that they lived in. They were able to take that and they were able to adapt to their environment, which is hugely important for Native Americans and people moving and coming from traveling across the Bering land bridge into a new area where they hadn't been before. So it's very important to realize and very important to understand that many of these groups and many of these tribes were able to take what the land gave them and take what they were able to find on that land to be able to feed themselves, to be able to make tools, to make their homes. And it was something that Native Americans in North America, Central America, and South America are exceptional at, as well as creating governments like the Haudenosaunee have. But they were exceptional at adapting to their environment and using the what the land gave them to build their society and create their society. So that's where I want to wrap it there, guys. We are all set for today. That's what I wanted to focus on. That's what I wanted to talk about. So all you have to do now is go ahead and go to that Google form and just answer the question that I gave you guys. It's just one question. You should be able to answer it in a couple of sentences. You guys should be all set from there. And that wraps up today's lesson. So I hope you guys have a fantastically awesome day, and I will catch you guys either tomorrow or next week. Have a fantastically awesome day, guys, and I will catch you later. All right.